All right, we're going to kick it off now. I know people are still joining in, but we'll start with our intros. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Evaluating Dynamic Passive Pedestrian Detection. Before we get started, I'm going to cover just a few items about how to participate in today's event. So if you are logged in using GoToWebinar's app, you should see the control panel on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner normally. If you're listening in using your computer speaker system, that should be set up by default. And if you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. For submitting questions today, you'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions in the questions pane of the control panel. Once again, should probably be on your upper right-hand corner. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And now I'd like to turn over to Julie Kentosh, Oregon ITE's president, to make a few announcements and introduce today's presenters.
Thank you, Molly. So first, I'd like to announce some upcoming events, and I am pleased to announce our candidates for the upcoming Oregon ITE elections, Molly McCormick and Diana Tavares. We will be providing some opportunities to get to know your candidates before the ballots open, but in the meantime, today you get an opportunity to meet Molly a little bit. In 2 weeks, Oregon ITE will be launching a Meet Your Board series to provide opportunities to connect in a casual virtual setting. I will be hosting the first conversation. It'll be October 14th, 9:30 to 10:30, sort of a casual coffee chat. Please drop in and say hi. I would love to see you there. And on October 28th, we'll kick off the second one in the series with past President Pat Marnell for afternoon tea. For our next webinar later in October, we're assembling a panel of local leaders on the equity front to discuss transportation equity in general and why it is important and relevant. And in November, we'll be hosting a traffic bowl, which will be reinvented for our new digital world. The best way to stay informed on these and other upcoming events is through our bi-weekly newsletter. If you aren't already a subscriber, you can sign up on our website at oregonite.org/newsletter. Lastly, I would love to thank our sponsors. The generosity of our sponsors keeps this organization running, and so I can't thank them enough. Now I am pleased to introduce our three main speakers for today, Travis Larson, Amy Wyman, and Shaun Quayle. Travis Larson. Travis is a transportation engineering assistant with DKS Associates in Salem, Oregon. He recently completed his Master of Science in Civil Engineering from Oregon State University, where he defended his thesis work on alternative pedestrian detection, worked in the OSU Driving and Bicycling Simulator Laboratory, and was the OSU ITE Student Chapter President. He is excited to be starting his career and is passionate about transportation safety and alternative transportation solutions. And then we have Amy Wyman. Amy is going into her second year of a PhD program at Oregon State University this fall. She completed her undergraduate degree at OSU in 2017 and moved to Phoenix, Arizona to work as a traffic engineer for Burgess & Nippel at 2 years before returning to OSU to graduate for graduate school. She is very excited to be a member of OSU's Driving and Bicycling Simulator Lab and is passionate about transportation safety and active transportation topics. And lastly, we have Shaun Quayle. Shaun is a traffic engineer with Washington County. He helps manage the traffic signals and ITS group and is passionate about effective treatments to enhance mobility and safety. Shaun has spent 3 years in the public sector with Washington County. This was preceded by 12 years in the private sector with Kittleson and Associates in Orlando and Portland. He's a graduate of Oregon State University and the University of Tennessee, so yes, his favorite color is orange. All right, take it away, team.
Well, first off, we just want to thank Oregon ITE for having us here to talk about some of the research OSU's done in collaboration with Washington County. So today we're going to be talking about our efforts to evaluate dynamic passive pedestrian detection. And to start off, next slide, Travis. One slide back. So to start off, I'm going to be talking a little bit about why we did the project we did, and then I'm going to turn it over to Travis, who's going to talk about how we did the research we did, what we found out, And then Shaun is going to take it away and talk about where we're going next with this research. So I want to start off first by talking about kind of the present state of detection for vehicles and for pedestrians. So you can see with vehicles, there are quite a few different options to use for detection. And a lot of times this detection is used to dynamically update signal timing to provide efficiency and safety benefits to vehicles. However, with pedestrians, you really only have one form of detection that's widely used, and that's the push button. And so these push buttons, right, you have to exert effort to request a service call. So it's an active form of detection. And then once you place that service call, it can't be changed. So it's static. So the static pedestrian detection. Next slide, please, Travis. So static pedestrian detection, per the manual on uniform traffic control devices, right, typically follows a walk, flashing don't walk or pedestrian change interval, and then you have the don't walk phase. And this interval is timed based off of an average walking speed of 3.5 feet per second. Sometimes you can decrease that speed to 4 feet per second, depending on the surrounding area. But generally, the timing is performed for an average pedestrian. But obviously, not everybody walks at the same speed. And so you can run into some issues with this static pedestrian service, which we're going to talk about with a couple examples in the next slide. So this first picture, you can see a visually impaired man being helped across the street. This is an example where this pedestrian might need more time to cross the street. Now, in the next photo, you see a large group of children trying to cross the street. Again, this would be an example of where you maybe need to increase the amount of time they need to cross the street. And these two examples represent one use case that we specifically examine dynamic passive pedestrian detection for, and that is pedestrian call extension, which would add more time to the pedestrian phase. Now, this last photo shows a man crossing against the don't walk signal. And this is the scenario where potentially if the pedestrian is crossing before they're served by the ped phase, or they decide that they don't want to cross at that crossing at all, that perhaps we could cancel the pedestrian call if it's not needed. And so that leads us to our second use case that we were specifically looking at dynamic passive pedestrian detection for, and that's pedestrian call cancellation. So, right, the solution to static pedestrian detection, we're thinking is dynamic passive pedestrian detection. Dynamic being that the service call can change depending on the detection input, and passive being that as a pedestrian, you don't really have to do anything to change that call. And so the functionality that we're looking at, it's not truly passive because we had pedestrians activate the push buttons first, but after that, the detection took over. So just getting a little bit more in detail on our two use cases we were performing this research for, first being call extension. So you can see with this graphic, the pedestrian call would be placed, right? The pedestrian would begin crossing, the detection would be monitoring this crossing zone. And then if that pedestrian is still in the crosswalk when the pedestrian phase terminates, the detection would recognize they're still in the crosswalk and let the signal know, okay, we can't let the vehicular indication change yet, we need to hold it red. And this improves pedestrian safety because even though vehicles are supposed to yield, right, for pedestrian, no matter when they're in the crosswalk, it violates their expectancy that nothing should be there. So then with the second use case, we're looking at call cancellation. And in this use case, we have a pedestrian standing in the curb zone being monitored by our sensor systems. And they place the pedestrian call by pressing the push button, but then maybe they decide to jaywalk or they don't want to cross, so they leave that detection zone. The detector recognizes that and is able to cancel the call that was placed. And this leads to efficiency benefits for vehicles, right? Because you're not forcing them to stop unnecessarily if there's nobody there to cross. It also leads to safety benefits because when you reduce the number of unnecessary stops, you're also reducing the potential for rear end crashes, for red light running, and you're operating the signal more in a style consistent with drivers' expectations. So with that in mind, we designed this research project to assess the accuracy and reliability of two sensor systems to perform dynamic passive pedestrian detection. And those sensor systems we'll get into in more detail later in the presentation, but they were optical and thermal systems. So in evaluating these optical and thermal systems, we asked two more detailed questions. One was, how does the accuracy and reliability of these sensor systems change depending on varying weather conditions, varying lighting conditions, and potentially different pedestrian shapes? And what I mean by that is the pedestrian pushing a stroller? Are they accompanied by say like a micromobility device? Are they carrying an umbrella? Different things like that. The second question we were looking at is identifying certain factors that needed to be addressed when you're trying to deploy this technology at different locations. So Travis will talk about that more in the results. So with all this information in mind, we did a little bit of research first to get a better sense of how we should design our project and sort of the scale at which it could be implemented. So first off, we looked at different planning and design guidance, such as the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. There's really not a lot of guidance or research out there on this topic. With the MUTCD, it does mention that you can implement passive pedestrian detection, but it doesn't provide a lot of guidance for doing so. After looking at that planning and design guidance, we looked at prior research, and again, not a lot out there. I'm not going to go too much into detail about each of these studies, but they really provided like the foundation for our thinking moving this forward. And most of them looked at curb and crosswalk detection zones and evaluated calls based on whether they were valid or false or completely missed. And some of the results as observed here definitely align with what we observed. However, these detection systems have changed so much in recent history that we thought it was really important that we evaluate the present state. So with that, Travis, I'm going to let Travis take it away for the methodology, but maybe do you want to open it up to questions? So I have one question here that came in. It says, can Bluetooth signal detections be used for pedestrian detection similar with vehicles? Travis, Shaun, do you either of you want to weigh in on this?
Shaun, you probably know better than I about Bluetooth application.
I'm making an assumption here that they might be referring to some of the Bluetooth enabled remote call placement for the pedestrian functionality, and that is my understanding purely just to place a call at the crosswalk. Really the passive detection is the zone that's being monitored, like Amy was referring to, at the waiting area, and then also in the crosswalks for those two different applications. So until there's sort of a Bluetooth enabled detection, I think we're talking about two different things, but feel free to clarify. I'd recommend we maybe save most of our questions to the end, and then we can kind of tackle everything from there.
Well, I will take it away from here. Thank you, Amy. I'll be walking you through the methodology and results of this study. So our research structure, as Amy discussed in the kind of some of the prior background info we looked at, we had to create a zone structure of how we're actually going to analyze these sensors. Because there are many different ways that sensors work. There's many application uses, many ways you can lay them out. And so we wanted to create a consistent structure for that. And so what we came up with was similar to most other studies in the past of having separate zones allocated for a single crossing movement. So in this photo here, you can see that we have two middle crosswalk zones and those blue ovals, and we have two curbside zones and the green ovals. And so we tracked a pedestrian or pedestrian type across an entire movement, and we recorded the results per zone. We looked at two different sensor types, as Amy talked about. We looked at two locations, and then those detection outcomes, like I said, were reported per zone, per direction they were going in the zone. So whether they were generally approaching the camera or going away from the camera, and then what conditions we saw by their pedestrian type, the weather, and the lighting. So first, I'm going to talk about the locations. Our first location was a signalized intersection. It's the intersection of Southwest Shoals Ferry Road and Nimbus, so right on the border of Beaverton and Tigard. I assume most people have driven this at some point. It's a very large east-west arterial with a speed limit of only 35 miles per hour, but a very large ADT of about 47,000 vehicles a day. Like I said, very large cross section, and so it's a little daunting to walk across. When I lived in Beaverton for a while, I'd run around here, and it was never fun to run across that street at night. Has very minor illumination, and most of the pedestrians that are crossing that street are related to work trips. So for the county's perspective, this was a location that satisfied major vehicular traffic with a wide cross section for pedestrians. Our second location was a mid-block crossing. It's the Rock Creek Trail crossing of Northeast Evergreen Parkway. So in Hillsborough, it's a collector, again, fairly large east-west corridor. Has a speed limit of a little higher at 45 miles per hour, but an ADT of only 17,000 vehicles a day. And it also has significant platooning. Has decent illumination, and then as you can see, it has that raised median with the refuge island. And most of the pedestrian trips at this location were recreation related. So families out on a nice Saturday, people running in the morning, stuff of that nature. And for the county's perspective, again, this was the use case of a signalized trail crossing with high pedestrian activity. So we looked at our sensors. This is a list of the different specifications generally for each camera, so you can kind of see the differences. But I'll just kind of highlight that we, throughout our manuscript, kind of talked about the pros and cons of these sensors just based on what they offer. So based on what their detection distances are, how many zones they support, what angles they have. So the larger the angle of view, potentially the less number of cameras you need. And so we looked at an optical camera and then two different thermal sensors that one was a low res, one was a high res. Throughout this process, our distributor, CT Northwest, helped a lot. They provided a lot of technical support and kind of go-between us and the manufacturers. So that was extremely useful. And one of the major caveats about the optical sensor, that it was not specifically designed for this use case that we were trying to run it, but it was a promising technology that is up and coming, and we wanted to see what the limits of it are currently. So now kind of the third piece of what are we actually testing, what are we looking for? And so like Amy said, we were looking at the accuracy rate of the number of valid calls versus the total number of pedestrian observations we see. And so a valid call is fairly simple. It's just simply when the detection is managed appropriately. So as soon as a pedestrian enters the zone, it turns on, it stays on the whole time they're in there, and then as soon as they leave, it turns off. But for an inaccurate detection, we saw quite a few different types of detection errors. And so we realized we wanted to classify them and to get a more accurate portrayal of how these sensors may fail while using them. And so we grouped those out into 5 other detection, excuse me, 5 different failure mechanisms that I'll discuss in detail here in the next couple slides with some videos. And then kind of another type of detection outcome was a false detection. So we did not just look at the video when a pedestrian was there, but we watched, if we chose a 2-hour segment, we would watch the entire segment to determine how often a sensor was actually giving off false calls. And so we'll also talk about that more in detail later, but we wanted to actually understand what sensitivity some of these sensors had. If they were just detecting pedestrians 100% of the time because they would detect anything imaginable, and therefore they're almost always on. So we're going to go through and kind of show you what some of these videos from the sensors look like. So first, for the optical sensor, the detection zones were these yellow boxes, and when a pedestrian walked through a zone, it would light up green. So you can see this pedestrian, as soon as they enter the zone now, it lights up green, and for the entirety that they're in there, it stays green. And then as soon as they leave, it turns off. Then we have the thermal sensor. In this case, we have 2 bikers going across. The detection zones for the thermal sensor are black bordered boxes, and when a pedestrian is inside of, sensed inside of them, they will bolden a little bit and then turn white. And so these are 2 examples of accurate, valid detections. So these are examples of inaccurate detections. We'll go for spotty first. So a spotty call was something when a call for service was dropped and then reinstated for any amount, any duration. In this case, it may be a little hard to see depending on what the lag is, but the zone is flickering on and off. And so in this case, while not a huge error, it was still not on the entire time a person was in there. And a spotty call ranged from half a second to upwards of 10 seconds. The average spotty call was usually around 2 seconds. And we did note how long those spotty calls were, just to get a general idea of what we were looking at. The next was a dropped call. And so this is when call is issued when someone enters, but at any point during their crossing, the call is dropped and then not reinstated. So in this case, you had a pedestrian enter the zone, and almost immediately the call is dropped. And so that green interior box turns off here on the optical. Third option is held. So this person is walking across the street, and when they leave the zones, the crosswalk zone in the upper right turned off, but the curbside zone stayed on. And so in this case, it stayed on for quite a while. But this is an example of what a held would look like. We have a late call. So in this case, pedestrian enters the zone, but the zone is called at least a second late. So you can see here, you have bikers entering, they're waiting, and it takes quite a few seconds to turn on. It actually takes a whole another bike to enter before it's issued. And then last, we have a miss, which is simply when a pedestrian is in the zone, but the zone is never triggered. So as you can see here, the runner enters, is in for a brief 2 seconds, but is never actually noticed. So results, some of the more interesting stuff. Although videos are pretty interesting, so. Sensor accuracy. The thermal sensor generally performed better than the optical. So, but they both showed promising results. So if we look at the signalized intersection, the thermal had a mean accuracy rate of 89%, so decent. The optical only had an accuracy rate of 26%. But then at mid-block crossing, the thermal only had an accuracy rate of 82, while the optical had an accuracy rate of 83. So the optical obviously performed significantly different for that mid-block crossing. In general, the thermal sensor had a smaller standard deviation than the optical sensor for both locations. And then in general, the high-res thermal sensor performed better than the low-res. The primary sensor errors we saw for these two systems for thermal, we primarily saw late calls and held calls. Whereas for optical, we saw mainly spotty calls and missed calls. And so this kind of plays into call extension, call cancellation. If neither performed at that 100% or 99.99% accuracy rate, where does that leave us for our two use cases? Well, while not explicitly part of this research, we discussed the pros and cons of each error type. So a held call, for instance, if a call is held, that'll impact call extension. So if pedestrian is crossing the street and one of the blue zones in the middle of the crosswalk decides to stay on, even though the pedestrian is no longer there, the signal controller will say, oh, there's still a pedestrian. We're going to extend that phase and hold the vehicular traffic for a couple more seconds. If there's no one there, that deliberately is against what we're trying to do, because as Amy said, it ruins driver expectation that it should be their call or their green to go through, but it's not. And so that inhibits some safety, but primarily mobility and efficiency. Then you have other errors like spotty, late, dropped, miss that all impact call cancellation. So if we have a pedestrian on the curb waiting to cross and there's a dropped call and the signal controller says, oh, there's no more pedestrian there, and they cancel that pedestrian phase, we are essentially forcing that pedestrian to either jaywalk or choose an alternative route. And so each of these errors have different consequences for the use cases we're looking at. But arguably, a spotty call is nowhere near as bad as a missed call. And so some of the pieces in our manuscript that you can go and read is just discussing how different signal timings and controllers could mitigate some of the effects of a spotty call versus kind of the inability to work with a sensor if it just totally misses a pedestrian. So now we'll move on to the false detections and kind of what we saw from that era. The most common false detection was vehicles that just barely traversed through a pedestrian zone and triggered it. This is quite common for both systems, but in general, the thermal cameras, we saw false detections from utility lines. We saw a street name sign that shook in the wind just at a perfect frequency, and the sensor thought it was a pedestrian. And then for the optical, we had a bicycle and a bike lane that crossed perpendicularly through a zone and triggered it. And one of my favorites that you'll see a video of here in a little bit was a signal head that created a shadow that an optical sensor thought was a pedestrian. So in general, most of these false detections kind of fall into two categories. And so this one, the vehicle on the curb, is what I would call an expected false detection. So no matter where these sensors will be placed, there will be vehicles driving very close to the curb that will probably pass through these detection zones at some point. And so whenever you're looking at sensors and their accuracy rate, they should be able to filter out vehicles. They look different enough from pedestrians, they're large enough, and it should be expected that they'll need to be filtered out. However, you have another option like this, that signal head shadow, that's very site specific. So in this case, you have a signal head on span wire, And we only saw this once during our entire data collection time, but for about an hour, this signal head, the shadow was right in the middle of the zone. And for about an hour, the zone was triggering on and off. And so this is one of those things where it's very site specific and you can't easily calibrate that ahead of time to expect those types of errors. So in addition to all the more accuracy related data, we looked at a lot of auxiliary data to kind of understand these use cases more, to understand some of the issues that may arise from them. And so one of the main things we looked at was occlusions. So just a very typical example here of a tall Class 8 truck that occluded a pedestrian for just about a second and a half. But if you had a truck that stopped, if you had an even larger truck, that's just something to consider. One of my favorite occlusions was a signal head on span wire that the camera was placed in kind of an awkward angle and the span wire was just low enough that the signal head, when it swayed in the wind, would occlude pedestrians. Another thing to look at is just what type of atypical pedestrians you may have. Many of us think pedestrians look similar, but we're not. Every human is so different and complex and amazing, and we use different devices. And so, especially as micromobility increases, you have people on scooters and bikes, as well as hoverboards. You have people that use stuff like strollers, walking canes, and that can all affect the way a sensor evaluates a pedestrian. So a sensor will look at contrast and shape, and that's how they determine whether or not it's a pedestrian. And so when you start to alter that, it can become difficult for them to recognize them. So in Oregon, even if you're like me and you're very anti-umbrella, I'm just going to face it. We still have a lot of umbrellas here, and umbrellas really distort the shape of a pedestrian from certain angles. And so we had issues with cameras not being able to recognize a pedestrian if they walked up with one. Another thing we looked at was the waiting habits. So when waiting across the street, did pedestrians move around a lot? In general, we were surprised. Most pedestrians were pretty stationary. As soon as they got to a curb, whether or not they pressed the button, they would stand still. Less than 10% of people kind of moved around throughout the zone, which meant we placed the zones in a big enough location to actually cover them all. And then there was a very small percentage that left the zone. And so in this case, it'd be someone who had a dog and they wanted to play fetch, and so they'd kind of walk around a bit. Or if it was a super sunny or super rainy day, and they looked for shelter. We also looked at the crossing timing, when pedestrians actually start crossing the street. In general, at the signalized intersection, most people walked during the walk phase, which is good. But a high amount, almost half of all pedestrians at the mid-block crossing ended up jaywalking. And so we compare this data with the push button use. How often did the pedestrian use a push button? And if we look, again, thankfully at a very large intersection, most people pushed and used the push button. However, at that mid-block crossing, there were about 65 to 70% of pedestrians that didn't use the push button. So if we combine that push button use versus how many people jaywalked, we can theoretically come up with a number of how many calls we could cancel with our call cancellation use case. So at that mid-block crossing, with enough people jaywalking and enough people still using the push button, we could have potentially canceled up to 15% of the calls issued at that trail crossing in Rock Creek for this study. And so again, that's quite a lot of efficiency mobility saved for that corridor. And so finally, kind of culminating all those things together, really just talk about installation considerations. What you need to consider when you implement this technology is there's a lot of things that we learned throughout it. But I mean, some of the big ones in terms of installation was just understanding your site characteristics, recognizing your detection angle, distance, just what requirements you're putting upon your system. And like I said, some of the waiting habits, push button use that pedestrians have. And then I'd say even more importantly, just your calibration, because so much of it is so site specific and where your zones are placed, what filters you have, what spacing you're using. That can be very, you can have very large differences based on if you have someone actually come out and calibrate it for you. And so really, we just want to emphasize working directly with your manufacturers to alleviate those errors in order to get the best results possible. But that also then opens up the door to this technology is not something that you can just buy instantly, hand it up, call it good. It's one that has to be monitored, that has to be calibrated, and may need to be changed sporadically to meet your changing needs. So with that, I'll pull it over to Shaun to talk about the next steps.
Excellent. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Travis, do I need to do anything to take control, or do you want to change the slides for me?
Yeah, I'm just changing them.
All right. Yeah, so great overview by Amy and Travis. As the managing agency, these locations are pretty strategic. As Travis just talked about, we have a issue with jaywalking at the trail crossing, and it's been brought up in the past, so why don't you guys just set the signal free and provide automatic service to the pedestrian as soon as they push the button? Well, we have detection for the vehicles on the main line. And then we also run the signal in coordination during the AM and the PM peak hours. So there is enough traffic on this arterial to justify saying in coordination. We've got signals on either side within 1,000 feet. So we are trying to balance things, and that's part of the use case is, can we balance this to provide service when it's needed, but cancel it when the pedestrian takes it upon themselves to go ahead and cross. And we have a fair number of signalized trail crossings, so this is a great kind of use case for us to test it out. And I'm going to show a video at the end of this, or at least kind of halfway to the solution of talking about call cancellation. And then the other location at Shoals Ferry and Nimbus is a split phased intersection, so it controls the whole corridor as far as cycle length. And we've got bus stop on a kind of kitty corner to each other. And pedestrians oftentimes, when they hop off the bus or they're just walking along there, they'll push both buttons and then cross. And with a split phase, what can happen is they can hit both buttons, cross, and then the walk sign for the corner that they just left to cross Shoals Ferry comes up, and they're waiting on the other street corner and having to wait for their side of the split phase to be served. So the pedestrians, not knowingly, have sort of shot themselves in the foot by creating more delay for the pedestrian by doing this. And widening the side street to get rid of the split phasing is a large cost, so a very high cost benefit or cost to doing that. So this call cancellation has multiple benefits, not only to vehicles but to pedestrians. And so as Travis talked a little bit about, as we think through the results of the study, and kudos to the Oregon State team because they did a fantastic job digging into the details. This type of detail, I think, serves as a great starting point for other sensor evaluations. I'd love to see this done at more of a national level where we look at these sensors and really start quantifying the types of errors that we're seeing. So not all errors are the same. Travis, if you want to go to the next slide, I think we have a couple of the pop-ups. So the departing curve is really where we want to focus for call cancellation, and then the arriving crosswalk is where we want to focus for the green extension. And then we really are focused in on things that would create sort of a more critical type error. And so with the call cancellation, we're looking at those dropped and missed calls. A missed call isn't as important because we're not going to cancel the call unless they push the button. So what we're doing if they get missed is that the call theoretically could be canceled. We're still working through this, as you'll see on a future slide with Intellite, exactly how the concept plays out. But conceptually, those are the types of errors that we're looking at. And then for the arriving crosswalk, great, we didn't have any drop calls, but we had a fair number of missed calls. And so we're working closely with CT Northwest and the thermal camera providers to try to continually improve the algorithm. And as an agency, this is one of the challenges with evaluating sensors is you'll decide, let's go ahead and get this up and start looking at it, and then there'll be a new release. And then you'll have to come back in a couple weeks or a few months and try it again. And at some point, your graduate student that's leading the research efforts, getting ready to graduate, and you have to go forward. And then there's a pandemic that happens in the middle of it, and you're kind of worried that there might not be any pedestrians, but then people decide that they can't drive anywhere, so they might as well walk around. So it actually makes it better for some of our sites. So it's funny how these things kind of work out. We ended up with a fair number of samples at both locations, but it's not a static process. We're working closely to continually evaluate this. And my biggest recommendation is start small. And for your leaders and decision makers that you're working with, under promise and over deliver. So this is a test, it's a pilot. If it works, great. If it doesn't, we'll take it down and we'll go back to our original. And that's kind of our philosophy. We'll take baby steps, and as it improves and looks more solid, we'll expand it to other locations. So yeah, you want to go to the next slide there, Travis? So we compare maybe the low res and the high res. We can get kind of a side by side, and maybe if you push the next 2 slides, it pops up a couple. One more. So we can compare between the low res on the top and the high res on the bottom, and you can start to dig into the details and look at, for those critical errors, what are the rates that we're seeing them at? And then you start thinking about how do we build our logic or the functionality within the signal controller to try to manage some of these things we'll talk about next. So let's go to the next slide, Travis. So like I said, we've been working with Intellite, who's our ATC software provider, to develop logic to try to make both of these use cases work within the controller, using the cameras as an input as well as the detection system. So if we go to the next one, Travis. So the green extension really is, like we talked about, it's holding that adjacent green phase for some user-defined value. We're going to start at like 5 or 10 seconds. This is a balance where you want to provide a little bit of extra time for the slower moving pedestrians, but you don't want the situation where you have a false call and the adjacent green is being pushed past its force off or max out point. So it's acting like true pedestrian signal priority. You don't want to dwell on, say, a side street in green with no vehicles there or a few vehicles there and create queuing or other safety issues on the other approaches because you're extending for a pedestrian that may not be there. So this is the challenge with these sensors, is you really need as high of accuracy as possible because we are asking it to do some pretty special things to potentially knock the signal out of coordination or create additional delay that we may not be accounting for in some of our evaluations. So as an agency starts to look at a use case like this, you've got to consider how often are you going to have pedestrians that are slow moving? How often is this extension going to happen? And those are the things we're working with Intellite on, is how do we log this so we get both frequency and duration of these extensions so that we can understand and kind of customize and tailor fit our signal timing parameters to work for each site. Let's go to the next slide. Call cancellation. Pretty straightforward. We are requiring the pedestrian to come up and push the button. So this is not passive in that the pedestrian can just go without pushing the button and just stand in the zone and get called. So they actually have to demonstrate their intention to cross by pushing the button, and that call goes into the controller. You know, every controller right now, or that I'm aware of, puts in a locking call for those pedestrian push buttons. And so that's the unique feature with Intellite, is working with them to have a conditionally non-locking call for the pedestrian. So the call is locked, and then it's going to look at the waiting area and it's going to see, is there a pedestrian there or not? And if there is a pedestrian, it's going to continue to serve the call. If the pedestrian leaves for some period of time, 1 second, 2 seconds, you're trying to extend it out so that the spotties don't necessarily cause the call to be dropped. And so that's where the value of what Oregon State did and Travis and his team did, looking at giving that level of detail of how long are those spotty situations happening, so we can try to manage kind of the weaknesses that we see in the detection systems. And then we didn't want a kind of a fail-safe situation. The call to ever be canceled for more than 1 cycle. So if the pedestrian's waiting there, the call gets canceled, we're going to relay an audible message through the Polera APS system. I say Polera just because they're the only ones that we talk to that actually have the capability to do a special message. through the APS, but certainly it doesn't have to be any one vendor. We just want a special input from the controller that goes to the push button to tell the pedestrian that their call's been canceled. And then once we do cancel a call, we're going to prevent the call from being locked out for some amount of time. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. And this is a video that demonstrates what that audible message might sound like. And hopefully we have audio. If not, you might not be able to hear it. But yeah, you might have to take our word for it, because it's coming through a little bit choppy, but it's a message in English and in Spanish to advise the pedestrian that the call's been canceled. Please push the push button, or please push the pedestrian button for service to cross Evergreen Parkway. So it's just an advisory in English and Spanish to try to help our pedestrians out if we do happen to cancel the call. It's hard because you want to have it be loud enough so that somebody could hear if they go off to play with their dog or find shelter in the shade. But you don't want it so loud that the adjacent apartments or houses hear this message over and over again, especially if you have an error. So there's always this balance that we keep having to work through as agencies to account for the fact that our sensors can't hit 99 or 100% accuracy oftentimes. So these are the balancing acts that we get to go through. Maybe next slide, Travis. So we're evaluating adding this to a design project that's ongoing on a nearby corridor in Hillsborough to look at call extension and call cancellation at a couple different sites. We have that test site that we're continuing to work with Entellite to try to get the full pilot running at Evergreen and Rock Creek. And we're continuing to call it a pilot for as long as we need to until we get perfect results. So maybe now would be a good time to take some questions. I don't know if Molly, you want to hop in here, or
Yeah, I have assigned the questions to you guys. If you want to read what you have assigned to you, there's a couple for each of you, or else I can read them if you prefer. And a reminder to the audience that you can still send in questions using that question pane on your control panel. And if we have time at the end, we'll see, we've got 12 minutes left, but we also will accept audio questions if we have time at the end. So you can raise your hand in the control panel feature, and if we have time, I'll unmute you so you can ask your question audibly. But feel free to keep on sending them in. Presenters, if you guys want me to read the questions, let me know.
I have a question. It says, you showed boundaries to your curbside and crosswalk detection zones. How hard or fuzzy are those edges? And if folks were immediately on it or outside of the boundaries? One of the pieces in our research that we did was we were not privy to the way that the sensor manufacturers actually run their algorithms and how they work. From our knowledge, for most of them, it was a hard line that as long as some piece of the pedestrian was in that zone, it could be triggered. So even if it was just their foot was barely in it or their head, the algorithm would recognize the pedestrian before they entered the zone. And so once that shape had entered the zone, it would turn on. But that is definitely one of the hard issues in working with these manufacturers, is not understanding what some of their more trade secrets are and how they do detection, how they do filters. And so very early on in the project, we had an issue with one of the sensors that just was not detecting anything. And we're like, okay, something's very wrong here. There's no way it's this bad. And there was just a filter, and for some reason, either miscommunication or something else, one of the filters had been installed. And so all we had to do was ask them to uninstall it. But that's just one of those things that, since we're not privy to how they actually run their algorithms, it's hard for us to make sure that each manufacturer is doing the same thing. And so one of the hard things for us was to try to create all the zones to be exactly the same for each sensor. And so if we had the zone for the optical sensor was 40 feet long for one of the crosswalk zones, we wanted, to the best of our ability, to make sure the thermal sensors had a zone of that approximate same distance. But that was kind of difficult because each manufacturer does things their own ways. And so that's definitely one of the reasons we say early on, like, make sure to talk to them about what options they have, how involved you can be in the process. Because honestly, some of the manufacturers, like, we were kind of closing up our initial evaluation, and we said we could, end our project meetings, and they were like, no, like, this is good for us too. Like, we're learning what you need. And so there's a desire to have that collaboration, but you might need to push the bubble a little bit and kind of asking them how they work.
Travis, I don't know if you had any others, but I've got 2 questions here I could maybe hop in on. So I've got a question. Is the detection able to differentiate pedestrian that want to cross and those that are just standing there? So I think the detection can be set up to place a call passively if the agency decides to have the system function in that form factor. We chose in this use case to force the pedestrian to actively push the button, and then the presence within the pedestrian waiting area is a confirmation of whether or not to cancel the call. And so it can be done that way. It just depends on how the agency wants to set it up. And for our use case, we're not going in that direction for these 2 sites. But I can think of potentially other places and other agencies that, like for rectangular rapid flash beacons, go ahead and have it turn on automatically as the pedestrian approaches the crossing, not force them to push the button. So there certainly are safety mobility reasons to look at something like that. And then I've got one other question here.
Shaun, can I jump in on that one?
Yeah, go for it.
So one of the filters that I know at least one of the manufacturers had was a directional filter that would turn on if the pedestrian only entered from a certain side and exited from a certain side. And so, for instance, if you wanted to kind of shed the issue of a bicyclist in a bike lane crossing perpendicularly across a crosswalk and it was triggered. If you had, they had directional filters that could filter that out by saying only if a user was traveling parallel with the zone would it be triggered. And so there are definitely abilities to somehow discern how pedestrians are moving and determine, like the question stated, if that person is just traveling along the sidewalk or if they're actually wanting to cross. But again, that comes down to trying to interpret human behavior and what we're trying to do. And so that was not something at all we wanted in this project. And so we asked them to turn off basically all of their directional filters. And just in general, humans make some pretty random choices at times. It's much easier to do a U-turn on your 2 feet than it is in a car. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't misrepresenting any data by some one-off pedestrian movements.
Yeah, that's great. The other question was related to with the situation of canceling calls and potentially calls coming in that weren't expected. Could we use ATSPMs to measure the before-after vehicle delay with and without the system? And that's a desire to do as a part of that ATC MTD grant project that I highlighted. That's a federal grant project, and so we want to look at before after explicitly as it impacts both pedestrian and vehicle delay if we can. And then we're also looking at doing some more evaluation with our our staff and potentially Oregon State to evaluate how pedestrians are reacting to the message and how frequently pedestrians leave the zone and then come back and actually push the button versus just continuing to jaywalk. So it'll be interesting to kind of look at this. It becomes sort of a more of a human factors study when you start looking at pedestrians out there. They do things for all sorts of different reasons, and I'm sure Travis and Amy and others got to see some interesting things as they sat there and watched, especially the trail location. There's a fair number of pedestrians going along there, but that's all the questions I had.
I have one other just popped up. Well, any of the sensors that you looked at, are they able to be deployed at solar-powered RRFB crosswalks? Yeah, that's some of the past research we looked at from, I think it was even about a decade ago. They looked at using, they didn't list what actual technology they were using, but it was some sort of passive detection. But they were using them for RRFBs in Las Vegas, just along different areas around the strip to basically, if any pedestrian got close to a crosswalk, that they would flash instantly. And so very, very low level compared to what we looked at. But it is an easy option that if there's any presence whatsoever, they turn on. And so that has been applied in a few different locations in the United States. But again, if you read our manuscript, it would list specifically where, but it was quite a while ago they did that study.
Yeah, Travis, I'll jump in. I know one of the agencies here in the Portland area did that at one of the adjacent high schools, and there were so many pedestrians that came through there that the battery on the solar panel lasted for like less than a day or something like that, less than 2 days. And so you just have to make sure that you know how many pedestrians are going to come through, how often is it going to get set off, and make sure you got your power sufficient on your solar panel sizing and batteries to allow it to work reliably in all seasons. Here in Oregon, we get, you know, huge dispersion in light levels. You know, summertime's great, we have plenty of light, and then in the wintertime, it can be tough to run a lot of stuff on solar if it has too much of a power draw.
Great. I'm going to jump in and just kind of consolidate two questions that came in. Talking about, does the detection systems work to count users? And then is it able to store data for traffic monitoring purposes? And along the same lines, are the sensors able to differentiate between one or many pedestrians?
I can jump in and provide a little bit of feedback, and then maybe Travis or Amy can chime in as well. So the systems can count the thermal camera, I believe, and I'd have to double check this, but I think it's counting actuations. So I don't think it's differentiating the shapes within the zone, but the optical camera system was differentiating the number of pedestrians in the zone, which I know is something we'd like to see within signal performance measures and just performance measures in general, the ability to differentiate the number of pedestrians that are there, because we may want to do something different with the way we treat the pedestrians with signal timing or phasing, depending on the number of pedestrians that are there. But that wasn't the focus of what we were looking at. But I believe if we can get an input to a controller, we can log it. Travis, is that your experience?
Yeah, I believe you're correct that with the thermal, it was just based on actuations. But one of the huge perks of the optical was that it would classify, and it was fairly accurate, whether it was a bicyclist or a pedestrian or a vehicle. But like Shaun said, that was not one of our research priorities. And so I more made mental notes about how it worked, about it being fairly accurate in recognizing if there was a group of 5 bicyclists, it would be able to highlight them all. And that's not something we recorded.
Great. Well, thank you guys. I know we're right at time. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. But thank you to Amy, Travis, and Shaun and for presenting, and everyone for attending this webinar. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact us. There's a contact us page on our section website, oregonite.com or .org, I'm sorry. And you will also receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Oregon ITE and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.